Donnie Darko is a 2001 American science fiction psychological thriller film written and directed by Richard Kelly in his directorial debut. It also stars Seth Rogen in his film debut in a minor role. During the 1988 presidential election season, a teenager named Donnie Darko sleepwalks out of his house and encounters a mysterious, menacing figure, a giant rabbit named Frank, who warns him that the world will end in 28 days. When Donnie returns home, he discovers a jet engine that has inexplicably crashed into his bedroom. Alright, so I watched Donnie Darko, and I've got to say, that movie was one of the more trippier, fever dream type of movies I've ever seen, to be honest. But definitely a good one, for sure. This was an incredible film. This Donnie Darko is a movie that I've wanted to see for a long time. It's often hailed as one of the greatest independent films ever created. It charts like multiple lists. And I think even I read somewhere a stage production was adapted from this movie. So I think that's how you know a movie really has an impact on the audience, when not only does it like spawn sort of sequels. I believe there was like a sequel somewhat made in 2009 without the involvement of the original director, Richard Kelly. But also when a movie spawns a stage production, that's a different type of level of impact, I think. So I think, this was an incredible film. Also, what I read was apparently when advertising for the film, right before it premiered at Sundance, but right before it released into theaters, the advertising for the film, it apparently featured a crashing plane. And so, which obviously makes sense because, the plane, the jet engine, that's like a huge plot point of what ignites the events following in the film. But apparently, because of that advertising, it had to actually be scarcely advertised because the September 11 attacks, 9/11, occurred just like a month and a half before. So I think that is probably what you call impeccable timing. And so, I found it very, I don't know, I don't think I'd call it hilarious, but just like highly coincidental that this, after 9/11, which was a horrific accident involving planes, this movie, which becomes so huge and a cult classic, is literally based off, or not like literally like follows a boy that, like just scarcely misses a horrific jet engine accident himself. So yeah, I don't know. I just found that to be quite interesting, how advertising had to be a lot more scarcer because of that. But like I said, this is a great independent film. And so I guess, I'll get right into sort of my thoughts while I was watching the movie. I will say, because the thing is, this is just such a good film, so I do have to point out some flaws. That's really like the only criticisms like that I can really point out right now, and that's sort of how the characters act in this movie kind of threw me off. I think the jet engine reaction itself, like as soon as it lands in the bedroom, it's like at the very beginning of the film, and it, there's like the neighborhood sort of like, there's like a crowd that appears around the house, like police tapes up and stuff. Investigators are there. But overall, I felt like the characters were kind of nonchalant about it, especially Donnie's family, who's, by the way, is like, they're like very, very rich, and very much upper class, but they've reacted very nonchalantly about this. And so I was kind of weirded out by that. And a lot of the time throughout the entire film, a lot of characters react in ways that just feel unnatural. They don't feel like normal humans. And without spoiling, if you've seen like the end of this film or you know about the ending, it sort of it doesn't make sense, but it's just like, it could be a plausible explanation for why the characters act the way that they do, because they sometimes feel like NPCs. Sometimes it just doesn't feel natural. But again, like if you've seen the end of this film, maybe that's why. But another thing that this film sort of tackles is the schizophrenia that Donnie suffers from. He goes to a psychotherapist, and he struggles, especially after hallucinating this, bunny named Frank. He struggles with paranoia. He has a hard time separating reality from fiction. And so I think there's, and this sort of like ties into like the character's nonchalantness, if that's even a word, just about everything. Like even the parents of Donnie, maybe it's because there's, the director was trying to portray them as naive and ignorant, but they don't even know the name of Donnie's therapist. And so I thought that was like an intentional choice, and I think it sort of just shows like the stigma around schizophrenia, especially maybe from like upper class families, or maybe in this world. But I don't know. I think that was another thing I sort of found uncanny. But I think sort of if it was intentional and trying to like illustrate the stigma, I thought that was sort of well done. Because I think like even the therapist is trying to deal with Donnie and his hallucinations, but really nobody in his family sort of cares about his sleepwalking, his paranoia. Nobody really gives that much thought to it. Like in the very beginning of the scene, we see Donnie sort of like in the middle of nowhere, and nobody was searching for him. So it's clear that this is a usual thing. But if it's a usual thing, I think it should be a lot more handled well. I don't know. So yeah, I guess a huge one distaste for me was just like the character behavior and nonchalantness and reactions to things. I will give a huge shout out to Drew Barrymore, who was in this film. I didn't know that beforehand, and so when I saw her, I was like, oh, that's cool. But she plays a very, very cool English teacher. I really liked her character because, of course, English teachers are some of the best people in the world. And in my opinion, she also gave like the best performance of the movie. She's only in it for like 5 or so minutes, I feel. She has like minimal instances here, but there's only like one chunky scene where she's discussing a short story to our class. And to me, it's just like the most, by far, out of all the characters, the most natural performance. It made the most sense. And so, I don't know, I just had to give a huge shout out to Barrymore. I think she's like a wonderful actress. And she just radiated coolness, it's the type of teacher you would want. So I really like that. And it sort of shows like how there are, even in this like sort of effed up universe, there are some good people, and so you have to sort of give yourself or trust your intuition about who you believe to be trustworthy adults, or who you see as people that are hypocritical, because there are adults in this world that are very hypocritical, and I'll get into that later. But another thing I want to point out, I love the dynamic between the Gyllenhaal siblings. Maggie Gyllenhaal also stars in this film, and she does star as Jake Gyllenhaal's sister in the film as well. And so, of course, there's no way you can just fake that dynamic. It just had, even though they're, of course, reading lines, it just felt so authentic between them. So I love their interactions. There is one interaction between them that I thought was very, very hilarious in the beginning of the film. And it's also similar to the table scene in Didi, which is a film that I reviewed on this channel before. But I don't know. I just like how siblings react with one another, especially table scenes. I don't know why. Table scenes just, get to me for some reason. I feel like the most thought-provoking dialogue, or the more hilarious dialogue, sometimes happens during those types of scenes. Of course, I'm referring to, this scene in Donnie Darko, Didi, Whiplash. I just love those table scenes. The best scene in this movie would be the one that happens in sort of a school assembly scene. They basically, like the school superintendent, officials, whatever, they like invite this, what do you call it? Like a local motivation speaker who's played by Patrick Swayze. And also I have to give a huge shout out to Swayze, of course. I think him and Barrymore probably give the best performances. I think Barrymore just like a bit over him, but Swayze, I think, does a wonderful job. He's very convincing as this motivational speaker who sort of comes off as a bit inauthentic, and who Donnie Darko especially just does not like. He sort of does not agree with the principles that Swayze, gives off, or teaches, essentially. And I think that's a very common thing that you see in sort of many high school mindsets. I think a lot of people, like when we have motivational speakers in assemblies, we're sort of like forced to understand and agree with their principles, and but I think that there's like and occasionally there's like one or two people that just don't agree with those principles. You know, they think it's very inauthentic, and so I like how that was sort of displayed in this film. Just like not agreeing with the status quo, you know, sort of thing. Another sort of confusion I had about this movie, because this is at times a very confusing film, but if you also allow it to be, if you kind of allow it to be confusing, it could be very great. But one thing I just could not wrap my mind around was the significance of this one character. It's this like Chinese girl, and hopefully she's Chinese. I hope I wasn't racist, but I think she is. And I'm just confused about her significance throughout the film, because there are instances where, you know, the camera, you know, pans to her face, and of course, you know, we see a lot of her gestures and expressions, and it's sort of like the way the camera pans to her, it sort of alludes that there is some significance to her character, but that's never discussed throughout the film. And I've seen internet theories about it as well, but there's like similar confusion about what this purpose and significance of her character does. So yeah, I don't know. I just found her to be a bit strange. She's a character that gets like bullied relentlessly without any provocation from her side. And so yeah, I didn't understand like the significance, because there's like, you can tell there's some purpose to her, but you just don't know what it is. And so I'm a bit confuzzled about what that was. Another thing that this film grapples is, and this is sort of like, I'm gonna get into like a more analytical discussion of this film, because I think this movie is really brilliant. And what this film grapples with is definitely the concept of controlling destiny. You know, on the surface level, this movie could be seen as a time travel movie, but to me, that's sort of, I don't know, I think if you consider it like a time travel movie, you're sort of disregarding the more, you know, like the more analytical concepts of this film, which I'm going to get into. You're sort of like dismissing it. Because this film does not only grapple with time travel, but like I said before, it grapples with, you know, controlling destiny, uncertain futures, you know, and also when talking about our future and talking about destiny, and when we ask questions, because, you know, we're humans, we're always full of questions. So the movie also talks about the disgust that we have with the answers that were provided. Sometimes we're looking for something and we're unhappy with what we're given as an answer. And that's sort of what Donnie Darko is going through as well. There's a cool interaction between him and his science teacher, I believe, and they sort of, you know, talk about time travel and destiny, but then at one point the teacher has to sort of discontinue the conversation because they're slowly getting into conversations about God and stuff, because this movie does actually have lots of mentions of God, which obviously makes sense because it's, you know, about destiny. And I'm pretty sure the school that Donnie goes to is a very God-affirming Catholic school, I think, or Christian school. And so I think it's kind of cool because the teacher had to discontinue that conversation because they were going into like sort of controversial territory. And I thought that was just like, you know, super representative of the world, like how, you know, once we get into sort of topics where, you know, you have to tread carefully, I think things become sort of, and when things become sort of controversial, then we sort of disallow ourselves or unallow ourselves from actually expressing our true, authentic beliefs. And so I thought that was very cool. And also what this movie does very, very well is how they have these characters. There's a character named Kitty, and she tries to pin all human emotion into this very reductive worldview. And Kitty and the motivational speaker, these are two of the more hypocritical characters in the film. And yeah, they just try to like see everything as black and white, you know, good and bad. But Donnie's like, no, you know, there's more to that. There's more to life. And I really, really love that. There's also another great scene with Donnie and Kitty, and they're arguing about, you know, the spectrum between fear and love. And I thought that was brilliant. And so, yeah, the more I think about it, this film is really, really nice and ahead of its time, to be honest. And it also reminded me of, to be honest, this is sort of like the male version of Mulholland Drive. Mulholland Drive is a David Lynch film, also regarded as one of the greatest not even independent films, but like one of the greatest films ever made. And of course, what they both have in common is they're both kind of fever dreams in a way. They're both about like hallucinations, and they both talk about like, you know, the stretches of reality and imagination. But I really like how they talk about, you know, both Mulholland Drive and Donnie Darko. They sort of discuss sort of or they sort of deprecate humanity in a way, and they sort of make fun of, you know, society and societal principles and the hypocrisy of, you know, people you're supposed to trust, you know. And yeah, I really like that, to be honest. And I think if I could sum up this movie in a phrase, it would be a phrase or a line that's heavily repeated in this film, and I just absolutely love it. It's "Everything will be okay." That's a line that's often said, and to me, what that means is sort of how you handle destiny and how you handle your fate. Not fearing the future, but it's also sort of tackles, you know, sincerity, and the choice to be sincere over being superficial, which also ties into hypocrisy, you know, and sort of like at the end of the day, you know, you'll see people that you have to listen to, and they sort of come off as superficial, but what you want to be, you don't want to be superficial. You want to be sincere. You want to be authentic, and even though people will sort of ignore that or make fun of that, that's what really matters in the end, and sort of being true to yourself. There's like sort of a talent contest scene in this movie, and I think that does a really good job of displaying sincerity versus superficiality as well. Um, and overall, as I just sort of wrap up this review, I think sleepwalking, the whole concept of the sleepwalking, I thought that was a very cool idea. And it sort of adds to like, because when I was reading the synopsis of this film before I watched it, I was like, I feel like this could do a really good job on like the whole unreliable narrator sort of thing that you like. Unreliable narrator is sort of a thing that you kind of see in films. American Psycho is a huge one that does that. And so I was really intrigued on how, you know, they would handle that. And at times throughout the film, before you reach the ending, there are some times where you're like, can I really trust Donnie Darko? Is everything that happens actually happening? You know, is this all a dream, sort of? And I thought it was a really, really cool idea. Apparently, Richard Kelly was writing this, or he had, you know, thought of this concept right after graduating from grad school. So I think it's really cool. You know, when you start young and you have all these ideas, you know, he really pushed for this film to be produced, and I think that's so cool, and very inspiring. But yeah, overall, the ending I thought was very great. It wraps up, you know, everything. It sort of answers all the questions. Very brilliant, you know, sort of like a plot twist as well. And I thought it was so cool. I would have liked the last like three or so minutes to be cut. I don't know if I can really explain why efficiently or effectively, but I don't know. There's just like this sort of like the last shot of this movie just seems a bit, I don't know, it just doesn't make sense to me, and it didn't really add anything to the film overall. It just didn't also call back to anything that happened previously in the film. It felt like this was completely new, what we were seeing in a way. And so I didn't really like the last 3 minutes of this film, but again, still brilliant. This is a movie of many genres. I'm going to give Donnie Darko an 8 out of 10. This was, again, an incredible watch, and I hope more movies like this are made. But anyways, yeah, hope you enjoyed. See ya.